Boris Johnson wants you all back in the office, buying train tickets, Pret sandwiches, and Greg's meal deals. But his chief scientist disagrees. Yes, the schism between the politicians and the epidemiologists is growing ever larger as the lockdown breaks down, and the Tories can no longer even be bothered to pretend that they are following the science. That's our main story this evening. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm great, Michael. How are you keeping?
Very well. All good. A little bit. I'm enjoying the sun coming back out again. I think lockdown works much better when it's very warm to be outside. That's my take for the day. Banal, but that's why you'll get the good insights later. Our main stories for today are going to be Britain's media doing the Tories' bidding by taking seriously the government's latest Russian dead cat. There were some pretty ridiculous scenes. Yesterday, Shamima Begum wins her appeal, and right-wingers abandon any kind of commitment they may have once had to the rule of law. And finally, this is going to be an entertaining one. The Change UK class of 2019 find themselves equally meaningless jobs shilling for vulture capitalists. You couldn't really make up what these guys have gone on to do after they formed that ridiculous party. Well, that's going to be our final story of tonight's show. Of course, before then, tweet on the hashtag Tiskisour and share the show link. First, on Monday, Boris Johnson hinted that advice to work from home was about to be withdrawn in a bid to get the economy moving. But yesterday in Parliament, during the Science and Technology Committee, the Chief Scientific Advisor, Patrick Vallance, appeared to contradict the Prime Minister. He was asked if advice on working from home should change, and he answered like this.
My view on this, and I think this is a view shared by SAGE, is that we're still at a time when distancing measures are important. And of the various distancing measures, working from home for many companies remains a perfectly good option because it's easy to do. I think a number of companies think it's actually not detrimental to productivity, and in that situation, absolutely no reason I can see to change it.
But this morning, in a Downing Street press briefing, Johnson showed he was determined to press ahead with what his scientists clearly think is an irresponsible decision.
From the 1st of August, we will update our advice on going to work. Instead of government telling people to work from home, we're going to give employers more discretion and ask them to make decisions about how their staff can work safely. That could mean, of course, continuing to work from home, which is one way of working safely, and which has worked for many employers and employees. Or it could mean making workplaces safe by following COVID-secure guidelines.
So there you have, speaking to a select committee, the chief scientific advisor saying, there's no reason whatsoever to change the rules. If people are working from home and that's working, why would we encourage them to go back into work when all that is going to do is increase the spread of the virus for no particular gain? It's not like sending kids back to school where there's a strong argument that, there is a serious issue that we have to balance there between keeping the R number down and then providing enough opportunities for children in this country. But when it comes to the difference between working from home and going to work in an office, the only variable really seems to be the profitability of pret-a-manger. Aaron, I'm going to go to you.
Yeah.
Does this seem to you like the government now has stopped bothering with any pretense that what it is doing here is following the science? So they basically just saying, fuck the science now. Don't even listen to Patrick Vallance.
Fuck the science, stay calm, save Pret. That's the government's new unofficial guidelines. I think you've really hit the nail on the head, actually focusing on Pret, because that's the part of the economy they're looking to save. And the government has claimed, repeatedly, it's interested in relocalizing economies. It wants to boost productivity, and it wants to help people in their work-life balance. And encouraging remote working does all of that, coronavirus or not. And all of our audience, the people watching this right now or listening to it as a podcast later on or watching it on YouTube later on, will know that offices, generally speaking, especially open plan ones, hot desking and so on, generally speaking, aren't particularly productive places. And actually, if anything, working from home is far more productive. And it speaks to the lack of talent and intelligence of much of the British managerial class that it's not often promoted. There's a culture of presenteeism, often to the detriment of the business's own rational self-interest. Now we're seeing that en masse here. And I think it's striking how rather than have a proper conversation about, hey, we should be encouraging remote working, helps with care of kids, helps with productivity, helps with all things I'm saying. How do we make that more accommodating? Maybe we could look at something like free broadband universally for everyone. Just a thought, rather than say that, like you say, we're about, prioritizing saving PrEP, maximizing, commuting, which by the way also has massive, detrimental impacts to things like mental health. People are wasting an hour and a half every day traveling from A to B and back again. This is a really stupid way of organizing society. It's perhaps no surprise then that the Tories want to return to that as soon as possible.
I mean, we're going to go through some stats, some public opinion polls about working from home in a moment. First of all, though, I did just want to look at one more moment from that press conference this morning, because Boris Johnson was asked a question about who should be looking after kids when people go back to work. And I thought his answer was just criminally irresponsible. We're going to take a look at that now.
Victoria from Tadcaster has written, you're urging people to go back to work if they can. However, our main childcare providers are grandparents. That means we must stay 1 metre from within households. Do you plan to scrap the 1 metre distance rule within households and allow them to provide childcare, and in turn more people will be able to return to work? Well, Victoria, it's a very, very good question. I think the answer there is that I think your grandparents your children's grandparents would count as part of the bubble that you're forming with, as it were, within with two households indoors. So I think you'd be okay, Victoria, I can tell you'd be okay to continue with those childcare arrangements within your household. I think what we're trying to say about the 1 metre rule generally and social distancing generally is that clearly looking through till the spring, looking through to the long-term impacts that social distancing will continue to have on many sectors of the UK economy, what we're saying is that we hope that by November, at the earliest, if we can continue to make progress in our struggle against the virus, then it may conceivably be possible to move away from the social distancing measures, from the 1 metre rule and other things by that time. Now, that is entirely conditional, as I say, on our ability to continue to keep the virus under control. But I think on your childcare, Victoria, you're going to be all right.
Now, that is, phenomenally irresponsible. He says on childcare, you're going to be all right. One, I think he's intentionally misunderstood the question there. So the person is saying, look, if you're telling me to go back to work, if I'm going to stop working from home, potentially even though I can and it's working perfectly fine, our only childcare solution is the grandparents. We know from all of these press conferences you gave in March, April and May that having grandparents look after children when the virus is still around is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. It is older people who are most likely to die from this virus. And whilst, yes, we might say, oh, it could be worth having people who are 30 or 40 going back to work if that's what they want to do. The idea that we should be encouraging grandparents to look after kids on a daily basis so their parents can commute into work is just phenomenally stupid. I mean, he there has tried to make out that, because she said household, they're clearly in a bubble. And if you're in a bubble, it means that you act as if you are in the same household. None of the rules that apply to the rest of the society apply there. But she was clearly just talking about the house. She was clearly just saying, do we still have to keep 1 metre apart in the house? And the other reason you know that that's what she meant and that it didn't make any sense, what Boris Johnson said in response, is that if you're in a bubble, the point there is that you keep your bubble separate from the rest of society. Whereas if you've got older people looking after young kids, and then you've got the parents who are going in and out of the household to commute to work, then you are putting that older generation, those grandparents, at a really great risk. And for what? To keep Pret a Manger going. And it's also worth noticing actually here. So if you watch that press conference, I don't think she came up in our clip, but the person who was flanking Boris Johnson there was not Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance. It wasn't the chief medical officer or the chief scientific advisor. It was Dido Harding. And she's been put in charge of the track and trace system. And her background is not scientific. She was, handpicked from a job as an exec at TalkTalk. So she's a telecoms boss. So whilst the Prime Minister is standing there giving this incredibly irresponsible, wrong advice, wrong health advice, which could put older people at risk of dying fundamentally, he's standing there with a telecoms boss. There's no one to correct him. And so that's leading many people to question, is it a coincidence that whilst Boris Johnson is going up there contradicting his scientific advisors and giving what seems like very cavalier, irresponsible advice purely to save his chums on, in cafe chains, that he has completely, silenced the scientists from view? We're only hearing from a telecoms boss and a Boris and the Prime Minister who knows nothing about science telling you that, oh, it's fine. Yeah, your grandparents can basically do whatever you want them to do now.
Supremely frightening. What are the priorities here? We're talking about Pret a Manger, Cafe Rouge, save Starbucks. Look, we don't want these jobs to be lost. We don't want unemployment to go up. We want as few businesses to shut as possible. And obviously, in the short term, that includes chains. Ideally, you want them to become worker cooperatives. Ideally, that's what would happen under a socialist government. But in the short term, it's not a good thing for these jobs to go. But it's certainly not worth saving them if we lose another 50, 100,000 lives. And I don't really know what to make of it, Michael. But just because from the government's rational self-interest, this doesn't make sense. It's not a smart move, because it just means the second wave, when it comes, is going to be far worse. All I can think of to explain it is the Tories know they have completely screwed this up. And what this represents is like a Hail Mary pass. They may be able to reopen the economy. The economic damage may not be as bad as it otherwise will be. It's still going to be huge, historic, unprecedented. And they're just hoping maybe the deaths won't be that bad. But it does feel like a Hail Mary pass. And look, Hail Mary passes in politics are fine, but not when it means you could lose 50, 100,000 people. And so I really don't quite know what the rationale driving this is. There's a prioritizing of the economy over public health, public safety. There's always going to be a calculation there. People don't want to talk about it, but I understand that, because ultimately, if the economy is depressed to a significant extent, that in itself has a whole bunch of negative externalities: mental health, physical health, homelessness, debt. I get it. But the idea that you have, grandparents looking after kids after everything we've just done, it just flies in the face of all of the, I'd say, wisdom. I don't think I'd ever associate the word wisdom with Boris Johnson. All the things we've learned over the last several months, and yet the government's just discarding it at a record pace. I don't quite understand where this is coming from. It still feels like we're dealing with the level of incompetence and ignorance that was on display right at the beginning of March. But this is just a different phase. We'll see. We'll find out in the next couple of weeks.
Let's get some stats up at this point. So we've mentioned Pret a bunch of times. We know that they're planning to shut 30 shops. 1,000 jobs are threatened. And we can get up this quote from The Guardian. So the food to go chain said it had reopened 339 out of its 410 UK shops, but footfall remained down while sales were 74% lower than the same time last year, as people continue to work from home. So the idea is you can see why Boris Johnson is pushing for this, because even though these shops are now allowed to open, no one wants to go to them. Why would you leave your house to buy a Pret? The business model there is people are commuting. They don't have much time. They're just going between Euston Station and their office, which is very close to that station. The business model completely collapses if people want to start working from home. But the problem
the business model is the whole business model. We've talked about the sort of the menace of commuting. Commuting means you may be cash rich, but you're time poor. People have the opposite issue right now. I mean, that's a good thing. I was coming into the studio earlier this week. I've come to London twice in the last 4 months. It was a necessary journey. And I went to Pret to get some water, because at Waterloo Station, M&S was shut. One of the two WH Smiths was shut. Only one other place was open to get just a cold drink. And even then it was empty. And I thought, God, I'm really wasting my money here. I had no alternative because everywhere else was closed. But it was there was an ideological realization almost. Wow, this is such a con. And I'm sure many people feel the same way.
Well, many people do. I'm about to bring up some public polling, which is showing that actually people do quite like working from home, at least 3 days a week, for example. This whole idea of you just have to get up, commute, you waste an hour and 20 minutes going to and from work, you have to spend loads of money buying coffee and sandwiches. People are really like, oh, there's an alternative and we kind of like it. So YouGov found that 68% of people who worked from home during the lockdown and who hadn't done so before, so people who were newly working from home, 68% want to continue doing so once coronavirus has passed. 68%, like an overwhelming majority. It's not difficult to know why. Britain spend longer commuting than anywhere else in Europe. Londoners spend an average hour and 20 minutes traveling to and from work each day. And we can get up some more survey results here. This is from The Economist, did an article about this particular issue, I think in this week's edition. So there were a recent survey by Unilever and Anglo-Dutch Consumer Goods Group found that half of staff in countries where offices were reopening did not yet want to return. Only 8% wanted to go back to the office full time. The rest said they would like to come in for 1 or 2 days a week. That one's less clear whether it's about the long term or not. But what seems clear is that very few people are gagging to go back into their offices right now. Why, when you know that there is a virus around, would you want to commute to work when you can quite easily do your job at home, and then you can sleep a bit longer, you can have a break where you walk your dog, etc., etc. But I think people are really going to reevaluate what kind of economy and what kind of society they want to live in after this, because so much of the dogma and the expectation that, yes, what you have to do is you have to get up at 9 every morning, or 8 every morning, get into work by 9, then you have to stay there for 6 hours, waste loads of money on coffees and lunch. You end up having not that much money at the end of the month because you've blown it all on transport and the stuff that you need to keep you going during the work day. I mean, people's lives in many senses, obviously we don't want a lockdown to continue forever, but I think many people are finding that actually having a bit more time working from home, to be honest, you're not supposed to admit this, but having a bit of independence from your boss, maybe not having them looking over your shoulder so that you can check news websites in between Zoom meetings. I don't think it's particularly productive when people are in an office, and what they have to do is they have to make sure that up on their screen is something that looks like they're working, even though they're kind of too tired and mentally foggy to be being particularly productive in the 6th hour of the day. I think it's good that people can say, I'll work a bit, then I'll read a bit, then I'll relax a bit. I mean, it's a better life, isn't it, Aaron? And I don't know what tools they are going to be able to use to force us back into the straitjacket of a 9 to 5 when this is all over.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to remember that, most people, again, watching this, most of the British economy isn't people who work in manufacturing or factories. The modern economy looks very different to what it did 100 years ago. 80% of the UK of GDP comes from people and services. Obviously, there are many jobs where people have to be somewhere at a particular time. Construction, education, healthcare. These are inherently offline jobs. But that's not true for many, many people. And what's happening for millions of jobs is people effectively repeating a sequence of actions, which is just the inheritance from the industrial era of going to this local factory or going to this local workplace, which employs everybody, and clocking in and clocking out. We don't have to work like that anymore. And there's a great book by a gentleman called Cal Newport. It's just, it's not a political book. It's about productivity. And he basically says, the most injurious thing to productivity, you can find that a good or bad word. Bosses tend to think it's a good thing. Politicians are meant to think it's a good thing. It's one way of increasing living standards without making people work longer, is increasing productivity, is to basically get rid of offices, right? We need to stop people going to offices. And the analogy he uses is, imagine investing in a computer or a machine for 20 years, like we do with education. Somebody is in education, say from 4 to 24. Let's say they get a degree and they maybe get a master's degree. They might get a PhD. They might have 10 years then in the job. There's 25 years of investment in what would be called human capital there. And what we do then with an open plan office and with social media is effectively we're pouring oil in the cogs, or we're splashing water all over the supercomputer. It's the last thing you want to do. And I can just speak, from personal experience, writing a book, writing a PhD, the absolute last thing I wanted was human company. Now, on the other hand, we know that loneliness is one of the major health issues of the 21st century. And so there's a converse issue here, which is people like to go to work, kids like to go to school after a while because of the contact, the connection, the social issue. So, there is a happy medium here. And I think, people aren't stupid saying, I want to go into work 1-2 days a week. that's not just some kind of compromise between Labour and Capital. It's probably an optimal way to work for everyone. And Boris Johnson in the press conference today was saying, you can't beat face-to-face. Well, yeah, okay, some things need to be done face-to-face, but that's 1 or 2 days a week. It doesn't need to be the 5 days a week. And I think we do need to have a really broad, thorough conversation as a society about what we want to do with this. Millions of people now recognize the dividend of digital technologies to actually allow us to do things they probably didn't recognize before. We knew that. We're younger people. We use these technologies. Many other people, didn't. Millions of people didn't. Now they do. My worry is, and I don't want to spin this back on Labour, who is going to inject that into the public sphere about, well, look, we can reevaluate, we can redefine how we work in the 21st century. Is it going to be trade unions? I'm not really seeing it. Is it going to be the Labour Party? I'm not really seeing it. Unless there's a mass social force pushing that, then it's not going to get very far. This needs to be like the 4-day week. Remote working needs to be like the 8-hour day. The demand for a weekend. It needs a mass social constituency. It's not going to be implemented just because the ruling class think it's a good idea. That's not how history works. That's not how any sort of social advances have been made for working people for 150 years.
And I mean, the argument that's going to be made from the government to say let's all go back to normal is it's almost emotional blackmail, which is to say that if people don't go back to work 5 days a week, then people will lose their jobs in Pret and in those sort of M&Ss at Euston Station or whatever, right? But you have to be more imaginative than that, and you say, yes, look, if people lose their jobs in those industries, that's a tragedy, but also perhaps we could use this opportunity as a society to make sure that we invest in jobs, in care, in childcare, in education, so that we can have people doing, probably far more socially useful and far more
precisely
empowering, enjoyable, interesting jobs.
Low carbon too. This kind
of
penumbra of industries around commuting and disposability, and this is terrible for the environment.
We've got a couple of comments. Mark Lungley tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Offices are just so bad. I've been working from home since the start of March. My mental health is so much better. I've got more sleep. It is madness to burn the 3 hours it takes me to get from outside Wolverhampton into Birmingham and back. I agree with those sentiments. And Yeti Face 14 with a super chat of €20.17. Take my money, comrades. Can't watch live as I'm working. Also a nice specific number for you, Michael. Thank you, Yeti Face. You know what I like. What can I say? We've got over 1,600 people watching. Share the show so we can get to 2,000 tonight. Obviously, like the video, like the stream. It helps with the algorithm. This week saw a series of suspiciously timed developments when it comes to the alleged interference of the Russian government in British politics. So the saga started when the government's choice to lead the Intelligence and Security Select Committee, failing Chris Grayling, was beaten to the post by fellow Conservative MP Julian Lewis. For this act of subversion, Lewis lost the Conservative Party whip. So Lewis's win against government expectations showed their complacency. The fact that he lost the whip, a pretty extreme action for doing, a perfectly reasonable thing as a parliamentarian. The election to heads of the chairs of select committee is supposed to be independent from government. So formally, he shouldn't even have been, rebelling. But yeah, so that shows sort of the authoritarian tactics they're willing to use. If this was the Labour Party or Jeremy Corbyn, obviously there'd be the media screaming Stalinist. They don't, because the Conservative Party always get away with it. But the real political significance here is that because there is not a government loyalist as chair of this committee, then the Russia report, which we heard quite a lot about in 2019 because it was delayed due to the general election, that we expect to be released next week. And I mean, we might speculate a bit about what's in it, but we'll probably talk about that when it comes out next week. What's interesting this week is that whilst on Thursday it was announced that that report was going to be released against what the government wished, it was coincidentally or not coincidentally a different story about Russian interference in British politics that led the news that evening. Right? We're going to look at a clip of the leading story on BBC News at 10 last night.
Tonight at 10, Russia is accused of trying to steal coronavirus vaccine research from Britain. The National Cybersecurity Centre says hackers linked to Russia's intelligence services have been carrying out cyber attacks on organisations looking into treatments.
That's pretty appalling, I have to say. At a time where the world's coming together, we're all trying to find a vaccine that both our people and people around the world can benefit from. To have the Russian government engaged in that endeavour, I think needs calling out, and I think the world should know it.
The Foreign Secretary also says that Russia almost certainly tried to interfere in the 2019 general election.
So it seems like a bit of a coincidence, doesn't it? Wednesday night, Julian Lewis, a Conservative MP, defeats the government's choice to be chair of the Defence and Security and Intelligence Select Committee. Apologies. And what that means is that a suppressed report into Russian interference in British politics, which the government didn't want published, it was announced that was going to be released the next week. It was actually confirmed on Thursday, on that morning. And then by chance, that evening, there's a completely different story leading the news about Russia, which, the BBC doesn't explain why that came out that day. The government haven't really explained why that came out that day. It's just, they put out the press release or the statements, and then it got duly repeated on BBC News as the lead story. Very bizarre. Let's take a look quickly at those claims. So the claim that was made there, Russian government agents have tried to hack into information about the COVID vaccine. And the second one, that Russian actors potentially with connections to the government interfered in the 2019 general election. I want to focus on that second one because the evidence is really thin, and the fact that sort of got a feature at the top of the BBC News at 10 yesterday, I think is pretty goddamn ridiculous. Let's look, actually, this is from later on that show last night, where they sort of explain the crux of the 2019 general election story.
But today we learnt about another operation allegedly linked to Russia. This one involved a more shadowy group called Secondary Infection, whose exact identity is less clear. It's alleged to have spread information online to interfere with last year's general election.
During the campaign, Labour presented a leaked document arguing it showed the NHS was on the table in US-UK trade talks. But today the government said it believed that the Russian group was involved in spreading the document.
So you'll remember from that general election, there was a document, the leaked document, about British negotiations with the Americans about the NHS post-Brexit. Now, this story is sort of like, it was the Russians that did it. All they've got, the only information they've got, is that this group sort of posted it online to get other people to see it. Really weak stuff. Let's look at Dominic Raab's statement, it was a written ministerial statement to Parliament yesterday, which is really the source of this news story. So Raab writes, on the basis of extensive analysis, the government have concluded that it is almost certain that Russian actors sought to interfere in the 2019 general election through the online amplification of illicitly acquired and leaked government documents. Sensitive government documents related to the UK-US free trade agreement were illicitly acquired before the 2019 general election and disseminated online via the social media platform Reddit. When these gained no traction, further attempts were made to promote the illicitly acquired material online in the run-up to the general election. So there's no real claims about who hacked it, who got these documents. The claim is that they were promoted. So it got put on Reddit in October. Not enough people were paying attention. So you have, I suppose it's Russian troll farms, I don't know, who are just posting, they're atting people with these documents. And now suddenly that's a top news story that the Russians tried to interfere in British elections. I mean, if you compare this to how the CIA have interfered in elections around the world, this is pretty small scale stuff. Aaron.
I mean, it's terrifying, isn't it? It's terrifying that the BBC, somebody in the comments has compared them to InfoWars. I mean, it's deranged. Normally the BBC require two sources for a story, unless it comes from the Associated Press or from Reuters. In this instance, the only sources for this story are the intelligence agencies and the Foreign Secretary. Now, clearly the Foreign Secretary is part of a government which is screwed up significantly on the coronavirus, wants to distract the public from that. And at the same time, as you've said, the immediate context is what's going on with regards to the imminent publication, we hope, of the Russia report. None of that context is provided by the BBC. And this is one of those classic instances where we see the BBC moving from being a public broadcaster to a state broadcaster. Now, is the BBC left, right, centre? We can have that conversation. I believe, generally speaking, it's social liberal, also economically liberal. So it's not necessarily easily identifiable with one of the two major parties, particularly under Jeremy Corbyn. But what it is absolutely an instrument of the government of the day. That's an inarguable fact. Great academic on this, Tom Mills, written a book, BBC Myth of a Public Service, goes into this in great detail. And I think this story is a case study of how the BBC actively misinforms the public around these kinds of stories, these kinds of events. We saw it repeatedly during the War on Terror. Another great book on this is Flat Earth News by Nick Davies, a Guardian journalist. Fantastic book. Talks about the transition of how media, print media, but also broadcast, including the BBC, increasingly resembles public relations. Increasingly resembles effectively an appendage of the state, of the government of the day. And this really was it at its most obvious and most brazen. It's kind of scary that the people that look at this, like Navarro Media, and say, well, this is patently ridiculous. It seems we're in the minority. This is laughable. I mean, I hope much the public recognise it's laughable. The idea that we're going to go to Jeremy Corbyn anyway, but the idea that after 45,000 deaths, the leading story, not just by the way on the 6, 8, and 10 o'clock news, but also the BBC website, also all the major papers, the leading story was a link on Reddit. And if our audience remember, this was somebody was just randomly tweeting this at journalists and politicians randomly. Are you really claiming this is the FSB? The FSB, the Russian secret services, the KGB, they infiltrated GCHQ, they infiltrated MI5, MI6 in the 60s, the 70s. They were really effective. And now you're saying that what our good friend Paul Mason would call hybrid war consists of uploading a document to Reddit and randomly tweeting at people. Come on.
All right, you might have thought, the one consolation of Jeremy Corbyn no longer being leader of the opposition is that whenever the government is in crisis, the media don't all just point at the guy, doorstep him, scream at him, and make him the problem. No, I mean, obviously, that's still happening. Let's look at this footage yesterday from outside Jeremy Corbyn's Islington home.
Mr. Corbyn, do you have anything to say about Russian disruption? Were you complicit? Did he help those attack our election, Mr. Corbyn?
Goodbye.
Do you have anything to say at all, Mr. Corbyn, about what's happened today? Do you regret what happened? Are you complicit in Russian interference into our election, Mr. Corbyn? Would you do it again, Mr. Corbyn? Do you have anything to add at all about what happened, Mr. Corbyn? Do you regret your actions, Mr. Corbyn? Do you regret taking that document?
Goodbye.
Why would he regret taking that document? There was a leaked document that was in the public interest, which the Labour Party used in an election campaign, which now we've found out that some Russian people were atting people on Twitter with. Why would he regret that? Why are journalists still doing this? I want to go to a section of a Guardian article as well, because it wasn't just... that was an ITV journalist, wasn't it? Well, that was a Sky. I can't remember what channel that guy was from. But let's go to this quote from a Guardian piece. He was a Sky journalist. British intelligence, this is from the Guardian report. British intelligence has been investigating for several months how a 451-page dossier of official emails ended up in the hands of Jeremy Corbyn during the election campaign. The then Labour leader said the dossier showed the NHS was on the table in the trade talks with the US. Now, why the hell would British intelligence officials be working out how that got in the hands of Jeremy Corbyn? Because you don't need to be a British intelligence official to work it out. It got posted on Reddit in October. It then appeared as the basis of a Channel 4 Dispatches documentary at the end of October. And then it was only a month later. So the Dispatches documentary comes out on the 28th of October. The Labour press conference where they sort of, hand out this secret batch of documents was on the 27th of November, right? It had already been in a Channel 4 documentary. It was a publicity stunt. Labour, it was actually a very intelligent publicity stunt. The Labour Party said, we're here to announce that we've got these leaked documents, which had already been leaked and already featured in a Channel 4 documentary a month before. So if you're the Secret Service, the British intelligence agencies, how did this find itself in the hands of Jeremy Corbyn? We know. It's obvious. There's no mystery. But it does help the Conservative Party to make this about Jeremy Corbyn to try and say that, oh, it's Jeremy Corbyn that's working with the Russians to try and, undermine the integrity of British democracy. And it seems like they're trying to deflect from whatever comes out of this report when we see it next week. And even papers like The Guardian, who are supposed to be, anti-Tory, liberal papers, they're very happy to play along. Aaron.
Well, I mean, by the way, it wasn't Sky. I believe it was ITV, which would confirm it's Fred Dimbleby, the son of David Dimbleby, nephew of Jonathan Dimbleby, and of course, grandson of Richard Dimbleby. And I think, it's really important. You've got four gentlemen here, all from one family, all ensconced within the British media. This is feudalism. Okay, this is what happens when you reproduce social authority, political authority, economic authority, purely through inheritance, purely through bloodline. That is feudalism. And sadly, too much of Britain looks like that. And so I think, we should perhaps plot a family tree. Richard Dimbleby, David Dimbleby, dipshit Dimbleby. Because this behavior is not becoming of a journalist, Frederick. This is merely shouting government attack lines, who is fundamentally a backbencher. Jeremy Corbyn is not a particularly prominent politician anymore. Have you ever seen the front of Dominic Raab's house? I haven't. Jeremy Hunt's house? I haven't. Have you seen the front of any sort of leading Tory politician's house, maybe other than Boris Johnson, because there were protests there? I can't recall. When you have somebody shouting at Jacob Rees-Mogg, they're a scumbag. But when somebody does it at Jeremy Corbyn, they're a journalist. We have a major issue here. This isn't journalism. This is harassment. Like I say, it takes place within the context of a feudal, political, economic, and social elite which reproduces itself in this country. When's it going to end? Why doesn't this young man go and harass and harangue Tory politicians and ask them about donations from Russian millionaires and billionaires to the Tory party? He won't, because this is not about journalism or accountability. This is about propaganda and attacking a person who remains actually the leading socialist politician in this country over the last century. There was a debate about how will the establishment treat Jeremy Corbyn now he's no longer a threat. Will we see him recast as this kind of lovable figure like Tony Benn was? Tony Benn in the 70s and 80s was hated, villainized, but as he became increasingly harmless, he was recast as kind of, fatherly, grandfatherly figure, kind of doesn't, completely unmenacing, very intelligent man, who would have been a great leader of the Labour Party. Some people thought maybe the same thing would happen to Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think that's true. I think the movement behind him, I think the ideas that were so insurgent during his tenure as Labour leader are still there. And I think they're still viewed as a threat by the establishment. And so somebody like Frederick Dimbleby doing what he was doing is still very much viewed as a positive thing by his peers. That will keep on happening, but it most certainly isn't journalism.
I do think there is a role for doorstepping. I just think that was a stupid. He was just shouting attack lines at an ex-leader of the party for something that was a non-story.
How journalistically do you take responsibility? Are you culpable for what? These documents, as we would both agree.
I think they were stupid questions. He was just shouting government attack lines, and it's a stupid story.
There's clearly a public interest in these documents being out there, right?
Yeah,
clearly.
We're going to go on to our next story. First of all, if you are not already, please do subscribe to the channel and turn notifications on so you never, ever miss a show when we go live. Shamima Begum, who in 2015, aged 15, went to join ISIS, has won her appeal against the government to be allowed back into the country to challenge the stripping of her British citizenship by the then Home Secretary Sajid Javid. Yesterday, in their ruling on the case, the Court of Appeal said she had been denied a fair hearing in the original appeal against the stripping of her citizenship because she could not make her case properly from the Syrian camp. So the government have said they will challenge the ruling, meaning it will go to the Supreme Court. This is an issue which divides the country. I personally have no sympathy for Begum, but I think she's this country's responsibility. She was radicalized here. She is a product of Britain. And I think that, she should be tried in Britain if she cannot be tried fairly in Syria, and she obviously cannot be. There is another precedent that's set by this case, which is, if the government are successful in stripping her of citizenship, is really chilling, which is that Shamima Begum is a British citizen. She's never lived anywhere else. And, well, apart from in Syria, but she's not eligible for citizenship there. And it is illegal by international law to make someone stateless. And the government have said, well, we're not making her stateless because her parents are Bangladeshi, which means that she's eligible for Bangladeshi citizenship. But she's, that's saying that we can strip her of citizenship because of where her parents are from. So they could, if I'd gone and joined ISIS, they wouldn't be able to strip my citizenship, but they can strip her citizenship because of her, well, essentially her ethnic background. She was born in Britain, which to me is a really chilling precedent. Many people in the country disagree with me. I think actually, according to polls, the majority do. Some of them disagree and say, we disagree with what the court have decided. She shouldn't be able to come back here to challenge the stripping of her citizenship. But of course, we respect the rule of law, which means that the ruling of this court has to be carried out. And then there are people like Talk Radio's Mike Graham. Let's take a look at his rant about the ruling from the Court of Appeal.
The thing is, right, I've been watching Sky News and BBC, and every time, even the other radio station keeps saying, Shamima, I can't pronounce her name, sorry, Begum.
Shamima Begum.
Yeah, it's a London schoolgirl. I'm going, she's not, she's 20.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That really annoys me. It seems like that they're trying to what's the word? They're trying to get sympathy for her.
Yes. And there is no sympathy for her in this country, as far as I'm aware.
What I'm wondering is, because she's support of the terrorist organisation she was, can she be brought up on the Terrorist Act?
Well, I think there's a pretty good chance of that. But I think you and I both, Kevin, would rather not see any more public money wasted on her. I mean, I'm
going to cost of protection.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I don't think because she no longer has British citizenship, she does not deserve to be able to come back to this country. There's no reason to change that, as far as I can see. And if I was the Home Office, I wouldn't bother appealing it. I would just say, listen, this is a lifetime ban for this woman. It's not a question of going through the legal process. It's a question of her having already been stripped of her citizenship. She basically has no rights here, so there's nothing to appeal.
So, I mean, that's a stupid argument, right? So for one, it's sort of conflating these two things, sort of like, we've got no sympathy for her. Why do all of these people who are defending her right to come back here and represent herself properly in court, why are they all defending a terrorist? Well, no, they're not. Very few people, I think you can probably count on a few hands the people in this country who think that Shamima Begum, what she did was actually a good thing. But the argument people are making against someone like Mike Graham is that you have to respect the rule of law, right? And the Court of Appeal, which is the second highest court in this country, the only court with greater authority, is the Supreme Court, which is presumably where this case is going to go next if the government decide to appeal it. If they make a decision, the Home Office can't just ignore what it does, right? Because then we will have no rule of law whatsoever in this country. And if ever you feel like your human rights are being trampled all upon, you'll have no recourse because the Home Office can just say, well, we made a decision, we're just going to go with it. And this is the kind of person. So Mike Graham is the kind of person. Maybe you're lucky enough to have not had to listen to him on Talk Radio, but he's the kind of guy who'll always be screaming about mob rule, cancel culture, the idea that people aren't getting a fair hearing, due process isn't taking place, and then suddenly, in this case, he's just like, oh no, fuck it, just ignore the courts. The Home Office can just do what they want because this person doesn't deserve any sympathy. That's a very slippery slope.
Michael, I think you're making the critical mistake here of not realising that Mike Graham is a complete and utter idiot.
He is a complete and utter idiot.
I mean, rendering somebody stateless, I can't imagine cancelling an individual more than that. And look, this should be pretty easy to understand. The rule of law doesn't just apply to people you like. Otherwise, that's not the rule of law. That's just looking out for your mates. I think Shamima Begum, what she did was appalling. I think she should face the full weight of the law. I think she should be punished. There's a broader context about her being groomed, about being a young woman and so on, in terms of sentencing, in terms of retribution. That should all come into play as well. But I certainly don't think what she did was in any way permissible or legitimate or good. But the point is, she's a British national. She has to be treated as one. And absolutely, you're saying it's a slippery slope, because we've seen these debates, by the way, for many, many decades. In terms of administering Britain's empire, people like Mike Graham's great-great-granddad would have said, well, they're Indians, they don't deserve the rule of law. Well, the person is claiming that he was, he's lost an arm because a colonial, policeman, beat him up, burned his house down, raped his wife. Well, it's basically about who who is allowed to bear human rights because they have the quality of humanity. And when you start claiming which individual does and does not have humanity, who is worthy of those rights as a human being, you end up in a really dangerous place. You end up in the wipeout of the Herero people in Namibia, in Southwest Africa in the early 20th century. You end up with the Armenian genocide. You end up with the Holocaust. Now, that's almost hyperbolic, right? Because that's the logical extension of this thinking. But it's profoundly dangerous to think that certain people don't have or don't merit the quality of humanity and therefore don't deserve human rights, don't deserve the rule of law, don't deserve equality under the law. So there's 2 points we made here. Firstly, she's a British subject. A British court has said she needs to come back. End of story. You know, these same people said they believed in sovereignty. This is what it looks like. British courts are saying a British subject has to come back. That's what's now going to happen. Get used to it. I thought we were huge fans of British judges making British laws. Well, here it is. Maybe it was about more than that. Who knew? And then there's a separate thing about, like we say, human rights and humanity. Now, again, if you only think that human rights apply to people that you like or agree with or get on with, that's not human rights. That's not universal. And again, I talked about this with regards to remote working and productivity and the fact that the Labour Party isn't going to bat for a 4-day week. Now, I believe Keir Starmer, for any other failings, he is a former human rights lawyer. I think, he would come out explicitly and defend this as a legal process, particularly after a judge has said she should come back. But there's also a moral argument here about what kind of country are we, what kinds of values we want to uphold. And if people aren't willing to say that equality under the law should apply to all British nationals, we have big, big problems. And the right are making huge steps. They have done now for decades. And unless progressives or people that just believe in human rights, unless they stand up and actually are willing to bat for arguments, which in this instance are unpopular, then eventually we'll see the return of capital punishment. We will see increasingly draconian court sentences, and we'll often see the administration of things which aren't justice. We will see injustices, right? And so we have to stand up for this particular claim of her being able to come back and to be able to access precisely the same process that the rest of us can. If we don't do that, we're not a democracy. It's as simple as that. If you don't think we should be doing that, you don't think Britain should be a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really obvious point. I mean, it's surprising that it's actually quite rare to hear that articulated very often I suppose by mainstream politicians, because they think it's such a hot potato subject. We've got a couple of comments. Nishat 1976 with a £48.99 super chat. Very kind. Thank you very much. Leftists must support and help establish independent left media. We can't rely on or expect outlets in the MSM or the Guardian, New Statesman to provide consistently nuanced, fair analysis. Good on NM and Tribune for providing much needed analysis. Thank you very much for that. I suppose it was the Guardian write-up of that Russia story was a bit of a reminder of where their analysis can be somewhat lacking. I suppose it's a bit of an understatement. Glyn Everett with a £4.99 super chat. Thank you very much. Says, have the best part of a February 2020 Bristol pint on me. One of you. Top work. Thanks. Not 100% sure about. I suppose is that how much a pint cost in Bristol in February? Maybe. We are going to go on to our next story. When the Black Lives Matter movement is discussed in the UK, it's often argued that our cops, while at times exhibiting racism like their US counterparts, are less militarized and therefore less violent. This is, in the main, a reasonable argument. We've made it before on this show. But a viral video has shown that the violent tactics that killed George Floyd are not alien to London's Metropolitan Police. Let's take a look.
Hello. We've got more units coming. Okay. We will deal with it there.
Get off me!
Remove your knee from his leg. Right.
Get off my neck!
Remove your knee from his leg. Are you going to behave yourself?
I ain't done anything wrong.
There we go.
Get off my neck!
Stay down. Stay calm.
Stay calm. Okay. Have you done anything?
Officer,
thank you very much. Get off my neck.
Stay down.
Stay calm. Stay calm.
It's not hard.
Have you done anything?
Stay down.
Get your hand off
You
your
lot, back up.
Stay calm.
Move back all of you.
Get off my fucking head.
Stay down.
As two arresting officers, you are forced to
Shut it! Bro, you're pinching his ear, bro. What do you mean, shut it, bro? Are you alright, bro? Fuck off! I'm recording this. Hey, Rob! Hey, Rob! It's cool! Hey, Rob! It's cool, relax! Rob, relax! Do not move back! No!
No, what do you mean now?
So I mean, there are two. One, that's a disgrace. Obviously, that video is a disgrace. But there are two sort of notable things about it. So one is you've got. I mean, that cop must have seen the killing of George Floyd. I mean, who in this country, especially if he should be interested in matters of policing. He's a cop, right? So he should know one the danger and also the significance of kneeling on someone's neck. In 2020, and he is there in the middle of London. Loads of people are watching, and he's got his knee on that man's neck, on that black man's neck, right? And then I think perhaps even more significantly, even the more important part of that video is the end of it, where because of public pressure, because there are people filming him and haranguing him and saying, you cannot do that. He's had to take his knee off the guy's neck, and he starts shouting at the crowd instead of shouting at the man. And then what happens? The situation becomes much less stressful. The guy ends up sitting up, talking sensibly to the other copper. So you have there a complete situation where not only was the cop at the beginning of the video creating an incredibly dangerous, as we know, potentially life-threatening situation, but he's also completely putting up all of these barriers towards there being some sort of sensible resolution to what was going on. The guy was perfectly capable of having a sensible conversation with the police. We saw it at the end of that video. What was stopping him was a policeman with his knee on his neck. Aaron, what did you make of that video?
Well, we're going to see a lot more of this because it's endemic. First of all, people of color, particularly black people, are treated differently by the police. We know this simply by having eyes and ears and looking at data. That's inarguable. But the big change now in the last several years is two things. Firstly, the ubiquity of smartphones, people being able to record these things. Often very high resolution, maybe even stream it. In addition to that, obviously, people use these things to find scale through social media. It's not just Facebook and Twitter anymore. It's TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. We live in a really immersive audiovisual culture now, but not in a way that is fixated with the television and the broadcaster telling us what to think. In addition to that, this is now viewed as a political issue, right? It's been activated really since Black Lives Matter, 2014, 2015 in the United States, but also here, and now particularly this year. So we're going to see a lot more of it. And the point is, like you say, I mean, how are police officers going to respond to that? And we've seen footage of, the police have lost the streets, right? Because what's happened is somebody has been treated like that. A crowd's then stepped in to try to de-arrest them. And by the way, if a police officer is acting unlawfully, that is legal. That is permissible. If a police officer is breaking the law, you can stop that person being arrested. If the police officer is not breaking the law and you obstruct an arrest, you'll be charged with obstruction of an arrest. And what I think we've seen with a few of these scenes of kind of, the police are kind of overwhelmed is that kind of policing and people pushing back. And so there has to be, especially in the present context of coronavirus, there has to be a more intelligent policing approach to this. And it's surprising, you talked to, I think, was it this week or last week, about the sheer volume of black people in Britain who are being, even now, stopped and searched, particularly in London, particularly in the bigger cities. And it's really remarkable. You'd think the Home Office would be a little bit more intelligent about it, tell people to kind of cool it a little bit. But I think, again, it's so endemic, it's so pernicious. The police forces of this country are so diseased with racism and clearly unnecessary, inappropriate use of violence. Even after all that, it's still so visible and so conspicuous.
So it's 22,000 stop and searches of black men, I think, during the lockdown, which is equivalent to a third of young black men in the city. That doesn't mean a third of young black men were stopped, but it's equivalent to that. It's lucky, though. I suppose what we can say is it's lucky that people were there to film it. Well, one, because it meant that the cop took his knee off the guy's neck, but two, it means that this guy has been now suspended. So the guy you saw there with his knee on the man's neck has been suspended. The other person you could see in the video has been removed from operational duty. This is what the Deputy Met Police Commissioner, Sir Steve House, told the BBC. The video footage that I have seen today and is circulating on social media is extremely disturbing. Some of the techniques used cause me great concern. They are not taught in police training. Obviously, we don't know how much veracity there is to what he said. Obviously, he's got an interest in saying that. But I mean, it seems plausible. And then you have to ask, if that cop wasn't trained about putting his knee on someone's neck, where did he learn that? Did he learn that from watching the video of George Floyd?
Can I respond to that?
Is that where he got the idea?
Can I respond to that, Michael?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, Britain. I did an interview with Ian Cobain. We're gonna publish it next week on Tuesday. Ian Cobain, author of Cruel Britannia and History Thieves, 2 fantastic books. I post about them on Instagram. To all our viewers, buy those books, read them, gift them to someone who thinks that the sun shines out of the backside of the British state. They might learn a thing or two. What he told me in that interview is that Britain formally hasn't been using a certain set of torture methods since 1971-72. Edward Heath formally said that. And yet we know that these exact methods were used in Ireland up until the mid-1990s. They were used in Iraq in the early 2000s. This is not a conspiracy theory. We know this for a fact. The army has admitted it. And so it's the exact same thing. Formally speaking, the army hasn't practiced these things. Nobody's learning these things. Yet informally, the exact same torture techniques that were used in Cyprus, in Malaya, in Kenya, the exact same techniques are being used in Ireland, are being used in Iraq 20, 30 years after the British state said they were no longer being deployed, that they were no longer being taught. And so the question is, like you say, are they being taught? Perhaps. Perhaps. And actually, if people wait till Tuesday, they'll hear a pretty good explanation from Ian Cobain, at least pertaining to the armed forces, about how these kinds of techniques actually maybe are being taught formally. We just don't know about it.
We are going to go on to our final story. Before we do that, if you're enjoying the show, if you want to support Novara Media, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. It is what keeps this organization going and what keeps this organization growing. Ex-Labour Shadow Chancellor and briefly an MP for Change UK, Chris Leslie, has found a new job. He is now, and you really could not make this up, Chief Executive of the Credit Services Association. Yes, that's the UK body representing debt collectors. Debt collectors. Right, let's get up the tweet announcing the news. You can see Chris Leslie there smiling that now he is going to be advocating for the people that knock on your door and take away your computers if you haven't managed to pay your debts in time. He is now chief of the bailiffs, I suppose. Leslie joins a long line of ex-Change UK MPs. Well, as long as you can get, there are only 11 of them to begin with who have found themselves in jobs representing the worst of vulture capitalism. So you remember Angela Smith, who, when she was a Labour MP, was writing articles opposing Corbyn's policy to renationalise the water firms. Can we get this one up? So nationalising our water firms could make us the dirty man of Europe again, says Angela Smith. Now, can you guess where she works after losing her seat in the 2019 general election after defecting from the Labour Party? You guessed it, a private water firm. So she is working for Portsmouth Water. They are not the only two who have gone on to shill for, the worst end of corporate greed, I suppose. Chuka Ummana and Luciana Berger have both found top jobs at the corporate PR firm Edelman. And this actually, I think, is the worst one. So, Chris Leslie being the representative of the bailiffs is kind of funny. Angela Smith being, a boss at now or on the board of a private water firm is predictable. But Chuka Ummana and Luciana Berger, them standing for Edelman is the most, or getting jobs, senior jobs at Edelman is the most telling one. Because Edelman is the world's biggest PR firm, very big, very important company. It's the world's largest company, specializing in laundering the reputation of global corporations and human rights abusers often. They've got top jobs there. Let's look at, over the last 10 years, some of the clients that Edelman have represented. So you've got the Saudi Arabian government. This is in the last decade, just in the last decade. News Corporation. So Murdoch's News Corporation, they provide crisis communication management during the phone hacking crisis. And the TransCanada Corporation, they were hired. So Edelman were hired to launch campaigns in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline. So that was transferring oil from the Canadian tar sands to Texas, obviously going through, famously, lots of Native American lands, huge protest movements against it. Edelman were there not only to represent the company, but to create lots of fake grassroots campaigns in favor of the pipeline. Now, this is called astroturfing. the most famous example of this. So astroturfing is when you've got a company who sort of sets up a fake grassroots campaign. Now, you might think that Change UK MPs, it's no surprise they've been employed to do this kind of thing, because that was kind of what the party was in the first place. So many, especially People's Vote organisations, sort of started up, but big funding and their support base often overstated. But yeah, I want to go back to the most famous example of Edelman's astroturfing, which is very relevant in terms of thinking about ex-Labour MPs going to work for this organisation. Now, this is from Wikipedia. Now, some people say we shouldn't quote Wikipedia. I actually think it is the best source of information, but I have also checked it. Let's get this up. In the 2000s, Edelman created a front group called the Working Families for Walmart, which said it was a grassroots organization, but was actually funded by Walmart. It paid 2 bloggers to travel the country, interviewing Walmart employees, one of whom was a senior Edelman employee's sister. According to the New Yorker, everyone she talked to was delighted with Walmart. In 2006, Business Week reported that the public relations effort, which was positioned as a grassroots blog, was actually paid for by Walmart. The New Yorker called it a blatant example of astroturfing. And I said this example was particularly, relevant when we're thinking about ex-Labour MPs going to work for this company, because the reason this AstroTurf campaign was started, Working Families for Walmart, was to fight claims being made by trade unions at that period in time that workers in Walmart should get proper pay and proper working conditions, that they should be able to, they shouldn't be on kind of like 0 hours contracts where you have to work different shifts over a month and you have to just accept whatever hours the boss gives you. Really low pay. The unions were organizing against it, and Edelman were employed specifically to do, oppo research, to do oppositional campaigns against the trade union. And now this is the kind of organization which Labour MPs, who we were supposed to all be, distraught when they left the party, these are people who really care about left-wing politics. They want to get into government to make a difference for people. No. What they want to do is, promote themselves fundamentally, if you're especially looking at Chukwuemeka, and now sell themselves to the highest bidder, even if that means oppositional research against trade unions. That's the kind of company they've now moved to work for. These aren't the only MPs that have done this. We're going to go on to some more in a moment. First of all, Aaron, your comments on this. I presume you're not surprised that these are the kind of jobs that these people have gone into. Chris Leslie, chief of the debt collectors, Angela Smith, on the board of a private water firm, and Luciana Berger and Chukwuemeka, now senior jobs in the world's biggest laundering organization, laundering not money, but the reputations of vulture capitalists.
Well, people that work for companies like Edelman, like Luciana Berger and Chukwuemeka now, their primary motivation is to become millionaires who do the bidding of billionaires. And it's sad that these people were ever Labour Party members, let alone members of Parliament, in terms of what motivates them. And it really does reveal the complete bullshit that they spun for years of the Jeremy Corbyn. Now, look, it's fine to disagree with Jeremy Corbyn. It's fine to think that the political direction he took the party under, even if they'd won, you can disagree with those policies. That's absolutely fine. But what they did was they often tried to disagree or dispute those policies from the left. Chukwuemeka would say, real progressives think this. A real progressive will, back some crazy right-wing policy because they want Labour to be in power to implement some batshit right-wing policy. And we need to understand it for what it was. And if you look at how Change UK were received by so much of the media, particularly progressive media, right? Particularly, parts of the BBC, The Guardian, it really does expose the complete venality and lack of principle and values, and actually sort of propositional politics they have in the 21st century. What do you want to do about climate change, demographic aging, inequality, the housing crisis, immigration? How do we deal with globalization of production, etc.? Look, we can have that conversation. They don't care about any of that. Anybody that wants to work for Edelman doesn't care about any of that. It's about making as much money as quickly as possible, doing the bidding of billionaires. And I think it really is the kind of signature end to Chukwuemeka in particular, the end of his political career. He's quite honest in saying he won't be returning to frontline politics. He was never there in the first place. But somebody like Chukwuemeka, Edelman is exactly where he should be.
Yeah, but stop pretending to be Labour, right? It's not only the people who went via Change UK who ended up shilling for the worst sections of capital. We've got Michael Duggar, followed up his stint as Shadow Culture Secretary by getting a plum job representing betting firms. So these are the people who are, campaigning against the kind of rules that someone like Matt Cousin is promoting, which would mean that businesses are less able to exploit people by getting them addicted to fixed odd betting machines, for example. These provide no social value whatsoever. All they do is suck money out of sometimes vulnerable people, who are often, don't have that much money to begin with. And then these sort of vultures are just sucking it from them, providing nothing to society. And then Michael Duggar's up there sort of representing these people against the campaigns of often ex-gambling addicts who are trying to get some regulation of these toxic industries. He's there promoting it. And again, Michael Duggar, he's the kind of person, when he resigned from the cabinet, he's a giant. This is the kind of thing that Jeremy Corbyn will come to regret, getting rid of this giant of the Labour movement. He's always been there, representing ordinary people, not like these metropolitan elite. Now what is he doing? He's working for millionaire, billionaire gambling firms to try and make sure that they don't have to be subjected to any kind of regulation, which would mean they can't, thoroughly exploit vulnerable, addicted people. But obviously we couldn't talk about, ex-Labour MPs going on to do completely amoral things without talking about their godfather, their hero. Because these people aren't anomalies. These people are following in a tradition of, a Labour Prime Minister. And the one that is most celebrated by the Labour right as the person he was the person who really instantiated Labour values in government. Then what did he go on to do? Tony Blair. So within a year of leaving office, Tony Blair. So this guy was already rich. Your wage as Prime Minister, quite big. He got a very good book deal, but then he still just had to make more money, doing more amoral things. So within a year of leaving office, he became a paid advisor to a Korean oil firm, so UI Energy Corporation. They had extensive interests in Iraq, right? You might think if people are already saying the reason they went into Iraq was for oil, maybe there are so many jobs in the world. Why do you have to get a job for an oil firm with interest in Iraq? How difficult is it to not do that? He also entered into this is Tony Blair, a £16 million deal with the Kazakh regime, so advising the government between 2011 and 2016, so for 5 years. He appeared in a promotional video stating that the then president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, showed a combination of the toughness necessary to take the decisions to put the country on the right path with a degree of subtlety and ingenuity. These are Tony Blair's words, in a promotional video for the president of Kazakhstan, who he's electively got 95% of the vote. So make of that what you will. And the position that Tony Blair took in this promotional video, he's been paid, or his associate, his company has been paid £16 million. This is what Human Rights Watch said whilst Tony Blair was still representing this government or advising this government. Kazakhstan heavily restricts freedom of assembly, speech, and religion. In 2014, authorities closed newspapers, jailed or fined dozens of people after peaceful but unsanctioned protest, and fined or detained worshippers for practicing religion outside state controls. Government critics, including opposition leader Vladimir Kozlov, remained in detention after unfair trials. In mid-2014, Kazakhstan adopted new criminal executive, criminal procedural and administrative codes and a new law on trade unions, which contain articles restricting fundamental freedoms and are incompatible with international standards. Torture remains common in places of detention. Now, that's the government who Blair was paid millions to launder their reputation. And you know what? It's a terrible defense of Tony Blair, but what people say, the Iraq war, well, this was someone who wasn't taking a dogmatic anti-Western position. He was against dictators. He was against people who suppressed trade unions. Why were people supporting? Obviously, people who were campaigning against the Iraq war were not pro-Saddam anyway. Very few of them. Again, you could count on a couple of hands, right? But the defense of Tony Blair was he cares about human rights. He wants to spread human rights around the world. Maybe he fucked up. Maybe he should have prepared for after the war, etc. But his heart was in the right place. This is someone who will accept millions of pounds to launder the reputation of essentially dictators who are suppressing trade unions in their country. And this is still, the hero of huge sections of the Labour right. And you do have to, when people tell you, if you're in the Labour Party, you are left-wing, you're progressive. How dare you point at a Labour MP and say, maybe you're not actually on the side of ordinary people. Maybe you're not in this to try and make other people's lives better. Maybe you're actually, in this just to promote yourself and ultimately, launder the reputations and support the bad guys, right? When people say, no, it's divisive to say that about Labour politicians. This was the Prime Minister. And much of the party was built in his image, as you see with the jobs that people like Chris Leslie and Chuck Schumer have gone into. I mean, it's depressing, isn't it, really?
Well, it's depressing, but also, we don't know how it ends. And the reality is, if Labour goes back to kind of a Blairism Mark II, which many people want around Starmer, people like Luke Akehurst and so on, they celebrate the Vietnam War. They say America, even today, they'll say the United States in Vietnam using Agent Orange, they were the good guys, carpet bombing civilian targets, war crimes. They'll say that, it's good to sell weapons to the Saudis because it stops the Houthis, who are an extension of Iranian, influence on the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, there's 1 million people have got cholera, have had cholera in Yemen. I mean, this is just outlandish. If Labour goes down that path, it's effectively a political corpse. And then from the perspective of socialists from the left, you don't want to be. It's a dead body. It's going nowhere, and quite right too, if that's what it returns to. Tony Blair's property portfolio is worth about £35 million. Just his property portfolio. This isn't somebody who needs these jobs, like you've rightly said. And yet he can't help himself. And yet he can't keep on making these rare interventions in British politics, which are anything but rare. They're kind of, you can almost set your watch by it every month. And I just want to correct you on something, Michael. You're saying it's the Labour right. It wasn't just the Labour right. Last year, many people who identify as liberals was saying that, if only we had people like Ian Dunt, James O'Brien, if only we had Tony Blair back, he was great. He really wasn't. The economy was doing very well because of financial services, financialization, debt leverage growth from 2000 to 2008, and then it obviously all collapses 2007. So you want that back, but that wasn't Blair. Blair was actually just quite an authoritarian politician. He didn't really have much going on upstairs, and particularly after the first term. The first Labour term after 1997 to 2001, I think it's a very commendable government. Introduces freedom of information, a minimum wage, devolution, extensive constitutional reform, pumps a lot of money into the NHS towards the end of the final year or two of that government. After that, it really goes off the rails, particularly after Iraq. And again, going back to this interview I conducted with Ian Cobain, he says, to be quite frank, after 2010, you don't really hear about extraordinary rendition because it stops. The Tories and the Lib Dems aren't doing stuff like extraordinary rendition. You aren't hearing about sort of, Britain being complicit in these torture black sites because we're not really doing it. And again, I would suggest, particularly Cruel Britannia is a fantastic book, to learn a bit more about this stuff. Britain was unlawfully, and we call it extraordinary rendition. The proper word is kidnapping people, sending one family, which included children, to Libya when it was governed by Gaddafi as part of the deal, which saw Shell go to the country and have a contract to extract its mineral resources. We were kidnapping somebody and sending them to Gaddafi to be tortured. And this was incredibly common. It was being signed off by the likes of Jack Straw and various foreign secretaries. And yet we still have people like Jack Straw intervening in the public debate and saying that Jeremy Corbyn's this, the left is that, we need to do this. These people are not just politically vampiric, they're criminal. The only thing that Jack Straw should be facing isn't a TV camera, it's a judge and jury. And yet they're still here. But like I say, this is a play which still hasn't seen its final act. We don't know how this is going to conclude. Are we going to see the reputations of Blair, of Straw, redeemed and relaundered in the 21st century? I really hope not.
That's a very good note to end tonight's show. Aaron and I always enjoy these Friday evenings where we discuss the week's events. We'll be back. We'll both be back on Monday night for the next edition of Tisky Sour, and then on Tuesday night, as you've heard, Aaron will be. We'll all be able to watch Aaron's interview with Ian Cobain. For now, thank you everyone for your super chats. If you do want to support us directly, go to novaramedia.com/support. Donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As I've already said, we'll be back on Monday. Make sure you hit subscribe. You've been watching Tisky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.